Today we're going to go over a bit of maintenance procedures, some of the best practices, just so everybody's on the same page of what's, I guess, to be expected. We'll probably start with maybe just changing a mainsail bar and chain. A lot of it's pretty straightforward stuff, but there's new people in the industry that haven't done that sort of thing before. So I guess there's a few different ways you can change the mainsail bar and chain. I guess this is the recommended method with boom stretched out. And I mean, a lot of guys may not use the pin. I guess the recommended procedure is putting the pin up. Another thing, it's nice and flat here and easy, but the stable ground is important, free of slash and everything else. The halves should not be able to move in that position. The other thing we've got, obviously the engine is off, it's really important. The computer's actually off as well, which is the recommended procedure. I know plenty of guys, it's a habit that they've got the engine off and the head's in a good position, but quite often the computer's still running. But the recommended procedure is to have the computer off as well, and the locking pin. I mean, the locking pin's quick and easy to put in. I've seen a couple of contractors, I think Buttons now have a point here where the pin's fitted on the harvester bracket. So I think that's a great idea. I guess it's something a lot of you guys will be doing maybe once or twice a day, depends on how the chain and the bar's going, but I guess, harvester's in a good stable position where it should not be able to move at that, Well, I think it's a bit of a blanket rule. I think, you've got a lot of different harvesters, whether it's a Satco, Waratah, Southstar, Woodsman, Logmax are probably your general ones around the country. They've all got sort of, they're similar, but there are differences of how they could hold residual pressure. And I think that's why there's a bit of a blanket rule across, because, guys can, could be working on a Woodsman one day, leave the crew, go work on a Waratah or a Satco, whatever it would be. And if you start having a different procedure for every harvester, there's the possibility of running into trouble. The pin, again, that's something that's probably a lot of guys don't use at the moment, but I mean, realistically, put the pin in, especially if it's mounted on the hanging bracket, is probably a 5-10 second job. The computer, to shut the computer down, probably 30 seconds. To fire it back up, probably 2 to 3 minutes. So I don't think it's a major. It's something probably that some guys won't be doing, but it's probably a good practice to get into. That's probably one of the bigger things, I think. Something a little bit new for me as well, that a recommended procedure is to have the pin in, which again is easy, and have the computer off. So I guess with the head tilted up, quite a bit of maintenance can be done. Also, obviously, changing your, I guess the recommendations are to have the knife shut. There's less chance of coming into contact with the cutting edges. So we've got the computer off, engine off, the pin in, and then the operator can pull the bar out. One thing we're doing in Nelson quite a bit of, we have knife protection covers that slide over these, especially if you're doing any other work where the knives have to be open. That's a reasonably new thing. I think Waratah sell them. A lot of guys make their own, or you can, but you can buy them through Waratah. I guess a lot of the maintenance that, some of the operators in the field could be doing is possibly changing a measuring wheel. See, what I would do, I mean, this is not the ideal bit of wood I've got, but I guess you can normally cut something up out on site, to fit. But probably a lot of operators do change their own measuring wheels possibly, but I guess you've got to undo the nuts and the studs there, and you can, either lock the measuring wheel in that way, or in the top, depending on if you're tightening them or loosening them, the nuts, and then the measuring wheel will just come off, new one goes on. Do many of you guys change your own measuring wheels, or you do, Steve? Yep. I mean, it's pretty quick and easy. It's only 6 bolts, I think. Measuring wheel should probably last 2,000 to 4,000 hours, maybe. But I guess again, in that position near the head, got on stable ground, shouldn't be able to move. Locking pin. I guess greasing too. I mean, whether it's in the horizontal or the vertical position, pins in. Most of the time, you can get most grease points in either of those positions. The centre roller, depending on the model, a lot of them do have a grease nipple to grease the centre hub. Sometimes you can bring the head in, rotate the rollers around in slow feed till you can see there's normally a little sort of divot in the side of the centre roller so you can get into the grease point. And then once you know where it is, again, you can stretch it out, sit the head where it needs to be, turn her off, put the pin in, computer off, and you can grease your inner wheels. I've seen guys in here with the engine running, with the knives open, and there's certainly been a couple of accidents worldwide where a guy's been killed doing that in the last maybe 10 to 15 years. I remember a guy in Australia was badly hurt doing something like that. When I think they had a guy in the cab, which is a real no-no. But the worst thing was the engine's running, the computer's running, and he's inside the head here with the knives open when basically the head's, I mean, the bar alarm may have been down, but regardless, you never get in the head, inside the head with the engine running. Computer off, lockout pin, then it's safe enough. There's a couple of different ways. I mean, I used to work for Waratah, but normally the measuring wheel will only come out once you've done a saw cut, and as soon as you open the feed rollers, it retracts anyway. I mean, I would say, I've dealt with Woodsman and Satco and South Star. I'm not absolutely certain of this, but I'm fairly positive that they're all similar. The measuring wheel comes out when you do a saw cut. So once you've opened the rollers, the wheel would retract in that position like that one. So it should be fine. But as long as that engine is off and the computer's off, there shouldn't really be any residual pressure, especially on a Waratah. What I was talking, I meant to say it before, but with the main saw, I think one of the reasons there's a bit of a blanket rule with the computer off is on a Waratah Bigwood with 626, you can't pull the bar down without the computer being off as well. There is residual pressure there, so I think, I talked to the guys at Waratah before, prepping for this a little bit. Some of them possibly hold a bit of residual pressure. I think some of the Satcos have an accumulator, which wouldn't be impossible to hold some residual pressure, but as long as you've got the engine off, the thing on secure ground, the computer off, you're generally pretty good. And again, doing the basic maintenance and items an operator should be doing. Things like playing with the valve. Most of you guys have probably seen me possibly adjusting the odd pressure if I thought your measuring pressure was low, but it all looks reasonably easy, but it's generally not something an operator would do. For your 99% of operators, normally that's your mechanic's job to be playing around with the valve. I mean, I guess your encoders, there's a length encoder in behind here. Again, this is the position you'd have the head in if you were going to put a new length encoder in, or if you were checking grub screws on the shaft. There's a grub screw. If I turn that, there's a grub screw in here and another one roughly in here. That's maintenance, an operator I think could do, if you're fairly comfortable with it. Again, as long as you've got the harvester in a safe position and all isolated, it's not hard to undo these 4 bolts, whip the cover off. There's a couple of circlips, you can take the encoder out, it's got a plug on it, fairly easy to replace. Main thing is when you put it back in the coupling that, the things line up. It's a little bit like a universal joint. That's a sort of a job possibly an operator could do. I mean, you might have mechanics that do those sort of jobs as well, but, changing measuring wheel, possibly putting an encoder in. You've got saw home sensors, one down here for the main saw, another one for the tops are up here. Probably generally a job for the mechanics because there's wiring that needs to be fitted to the head module, which you need, special tools to do that. It's something normally that a mechanic or a service guy would come and do. I guess basic, changing a blown hose, depending on which one it is, you may have to remove covers. Again, the key is having the head in a safe position. Probably on a base, a lot of the time you'll let the sort of residual pressure on the base machine go, so you're not losing too much oil or, making a mess and everything else. You'd have your glasses on for eye protection, just in case there is a little bit of residual pressure in the lines. From my experience, generally there's not a lot on the harvester head when you undo a hose. I've never really seen it spray out, but I mean, there's still got to be care taken, wearing your glasses. I think with a harvester there's a lot more going on, a lot more moving parts. I mean, a grapple hay that open and closes. This you got chainsaws, feeding out, returning, knives, rollers, it's a head harvester tilting up and down. So there is a lot more going on with a harvester. So it's probably, I still see younger guys that are learning and they probably don't get some of the training they probably need to probably really appreciate maybe what can go wrong. I always say it's a little bit like getting a helicopter, just saying don't fly too high to get the hang of it. The harvest is a little bit the same. It's something that really, it's worth a lot of money, a brand new one. There should be some training. I mean, I think a big thing, is just knowing what you're capable of. I guess when you're doing your greasing, just to be looking around for loose bolts or, I've seen a measuring wheel, fall off. And if the guy had been looking at it a little bit harder, he probably would have picked up on that. I guess even changing feed rollers, it's only 5 bolts. how you can end friend them. They'll normally wear on one side. You'll physically see them. These are pretty nice and even, but once they're worn on one side, the bolts can be undone, the feed roller can be rotated. They're probably fairly tight, but with a big bar, it's maybe another job for the mechanic, but it's something probably an operator could do too if he's keen enough and got the right equipment. If I was picking three things, we've got the engine off, we've got the computer off, and we've got the harvester in a secure position. The engine to me is the most important. I mean, they're all important, but if that engine's running, you're in the dark a little bit, especially, if you've got a mate up there helping you. I mean, no one should be in the cab, especially the engine running if you're down here doing any work, but the engine off is the key. I think most guys wouldn't be working around a head, especially if you're doing something a little bit more involved with the engine running. I guess with the saws, you have proximity switches, like a saw home sensor. As soon as that bar comes out, that tells the computer that the bar or the swing arm is off the proc switch, and then which sends a message where there's no way a tree should be able to be fed through the head. And anybody that bends a bar, it's generally because the main saw proc switch, or possibly a proc switch, is damaged. But from what I've seen over the years, it's normally because there's a hydraulic hose. Normally the saw oiler hose has been replaced with a steel braided hose, and it's picking up steel in the hydraulic hose that's running past the proc switch. And normally it's just as simple as cable tying it slightly different position where it doesn't run across the procs. Because if you do a saw cut and the hoses run past the proc switch, the computer thinks the saw's home and it'll feed the tree up and just bend the bar in on a right angle normally. So and I see that probably get maybe 3 or 4 calls a year about that, and I always say, hey guys, it'll be the hosing's probably running past. I had one actually last week. So that's something to, if you're bending bars, generally it's that.
Is there any standard safety procedures for changing the top saw chain or the bar? These are short people that can't reach it?
Exactly. Getting up here is not dead straightforward.
Especially with muddy boots.
I've seen the odd guy cut a block and stand on a block. I see plenty of guys standing on here. Mm-hmm. I guess, even with oil, it's one of those things, I guess...
all those sharp bits.
Yeah, totally. And even that's why the knife protection covers, that's something we've brought in at, I guess, 141 and Nelson. The guys have to have them. I mean, I've seen the odd guy cut, they are sharp, If you slip and landed on that, you're going to cut yourself.
Even if you grab hold of it with your hand.
Oh, totally. And I think generally we've said to the guy, when they're open and you're doing any work in here, the knife protection cover should be on. And they're just like a big sock that sort of slides on. There's different sort of ones you can get.
Brett, just assuming that everybody here was not an operator or were new operators, just daily, weekly, monthly maintenance as far as greasing, how you've got it set up. Do you want to just run through quickly what are the, whether things are being missed or what's the best way?
Yep. Actually, just I guess one thing I was just thinking too is, sometimes you'll ask a mate whether he's a hauler driver or a skidder driver that may not be familiar with that. It's probably good to have a quick chat. Especially I've had the odd guy helping me that might drive the hauler because the other guy's away, and I said, hey, I just need you to operate a function for me because I want to test this. So I guess it's good to have it doesn't come up very often, but things come up, it's good to have a talk about it just so you're on the same page of what you're trying to achieve. And if the guy is not comfortable with it, or if he, you got all these buttons on the joystick, normally I might say, hey, I just need you to hold that one down, and then I'll give you with the radio, we get a bit of a plan going. But I guess it's not something to take for granted either, if you're working on the harvest, because things, if you hit the wrong button and you're not expecting it, again, generally that would be more of probably a maintenance, mechanic job, I guess. But as far as the greasing, most of the grease points are done once a day. The centre hub that has a nipple in it, once a week, once a fortnight. A centre roller is normally greased maybe once a week, once a fortnight. The measuring wheel, normally it's only once a week. You can over grease it, and then it can blow the seals in the back of the measuring wheel. So normally it's only 2 to 3 pumps. That's sort of spot on. If you spin the wheel and you're only getting maybe a half a turn to a turn out of it, I've seen it where a guy spun the wheel and it's done 20 revolutions, just too dry. And that also can affect length measuring if the measuring wheel is too free. So most of the other test grease points are normally once a day. They're normally fairly easy to see. I mean, everybody would know on the harvester where the points are. Some of them there's some of them on the swing arm. Each model can be slightly different, but the swing arm, I think normally about once a week. Rotator, you know, again, up ears can be quite difficult. A lot of guys will lay it over, so you can grease the rotating, the ring in the rotator. If you're ever replacing welding on the head, this is, you know, if you're welding on the actual harvester head itself, the head module for the computer, the plug should be out. This model here, the head module's down, there's a cover down the back in here, and there's 3 big black plugs and 2 grey ones. The grey ones you squeeze and just pull out, the other one's got an Allen key, you'd undo the 3 black plugs, and then that's sort of isolating the head module from any current that a welder could possibly fry the head module basically. And it was on the base machine. You normally remove the plugs from the computer. I guess also at the batteries there's a fuse, you can pull the fuse, because the Waratah computer's wired directly to the battery. So again, if you turn the ignition off, well, that's how it should be wired. So the Waratah electrics is wired directly to the battery. So there's normally a fuse here, you can just pull the fuse and that'll isolate that. So you've got, I guess, cutting edges on the knives. Again, these are obviously replaceable, as you can see a little bit of wear in here, but they're a little bit like the tyres on your vehicle. They can be fairly, there can be wear in them, but they'll get to a certain stage where part of the knife will start peeling off, where you might get cracks in it, but there's no problem with that knife. There's a little bit of wear in here because that's one of the main points where you're delimbing the log. But again, this is more of a mechanic's job to put, you've got a gases out, sit the new one in, get on the right angle, they'll weld it in. I suppose sharpening the knife is something an operator would do. I use a little disc grinder with a flatter disc on it. For myself, I find it easy with the knives open. I normally lay the head over with the head on the ground, the knives and rollers open, and I'm just you got your safety, your glasses on, and just grinding, just sharpening the edge a little bit. Normally, if it gets too much of a bevel on it, you may need a bigger grinder just to get the angles right. Again, they sort of wear and stay reasonably sharp. I would say definitely, obviously, engine off with a filling machine if you're changing the bar and chain. I guess there isn't a computer with most filling machines, there isn't a computer. So I guess as long as you've got, stretch the boom out, lay the head over in clear ground, you'll be tripping over slash and branches or anything else, and be fairly similar principles to a harvester. I think this is a great idea what these guys have done. They've got a little pipe that the pin can fit into, because it's easy to come out of the harvester and you've forgotten the pin in the cab, and a lot of the time that might be just all it takes, where the guy thinks, oh look, no one's looking, I'll just change I'm not walking back up the cab and getting them out of the toolbox. So I think that's a great idea. I guess probably one of the bigger things that we've talked about today that possibly a lot of operators don't do at the moment is put the pin in doing the main saw, and probably the computer's still running. And to be fair, I've done that too, but I guess you've got to have some guidelines and a bit of a blanket rule, because it's a grey area otherwise, depending on what's, you might have driven a Waratah and you move on to a Satco or a Woodsman or whatever, and they might be slightly different with residual pressure. And like I say, with a Waratah Bigwood, you can't pull the bar out if the computer's running, so they have to turn the computer off anyway. But that's possibly one of the bigger things we've talked about that could be something new for you guys, eh?